Hello and welcome to another episode of Open World Chat. I'm John Odom and my co-host is Leanne Allen. Today we are joined by Paul Wilson and Tony Panacchio. It's a show that begins with Paul discussing his new film, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, discussing some of his other work, including teasing a role in an upcoming Showtime series, and Tony discussing his work with the likes of William Shatner and Stan Lee, but turns into a pretty freewheeling conversation, as you'll hear. Here's Tony and Paul.
So, Paul, we hear that you have a new movie coming out called The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, coming out June 4th, which, by the way, is my birthday.
Well, I am glad to provide entertainment for your birthday.
So tell us a little bit about it.
Well, the Conjuring franchise, now in its third iteration, called The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. You know, when we started this project, which was pre-pandemic, of course, almost 2 years ago, next week was the first script table read with the entire cast. And my brother Patrick and the great Vera Farmiga have really created this franchise with James Wan and Peter Safran and the entire New Line team that has, you know, what's interesting about it, there were more than 1,000 cases of demonology investigated by the only American couple that were kind of anointed, if you were, by the papacy and by the Catholic Church to perform exorcisms, even though they weren't clergy. That's where this all began. They were the first couple that were called into what became the Amityville Horror. Josh Brolin's dad, I think, starred in that movie when it first came out. Obviously, I'm very excited to be a part of it and then to share the screen with my little brother and be a part of that. We've only done that one other time, been in a movie one other time together. But this one is really their franchise. And I'm just I play a dad, and it's every dad's worst nightmare. You know, the movie begins with my 9-year-old child. Now he's was in WandaVision, Julian Hilliard, but Julian plays David, and so the story begins, the script begins, the movie begins with him being possessed, and in the real, what's really kind of, I think, chilling in a lot of ways, even though this movie is not, this is not a slasher, scary type. It's definitely got spooks and definitely got some really nice scares, but it's another chapter in the Warrens' story where my character, who I play, Carl Glotzel, in 1982-ish, see his son, David, played by Julian Hilliard, exhibiting some kind of weird behavior. And so I have to call the ghost hunters in the area, Lorraine and Ed Warren, to come figure out what is wrong with my son. I don't understand it. So that became a book called The Devil in Connecticut, which was a really popular book, but it was the very first case. And I think this is the crux of the story that I think, this type of fan or of the genre will certainly embrace. The very first case that demonic possession was used as a defense in court. So as the story begins, the exorcism of my son yields, again, every dad's worst nightmare. The demon leaves my son and then goes into the boyfriend of my teenage daughter. And then his name is Arnie Cheyenne Johnson. And then he commits a murder and claims that he was possessed. And they go to court and effectively argue, Your Honor, you make people swear on a Bible. So you acknowledge the existence of God in court. I think it's time we acknowledge the existence of the devil. And that's the crux of the story.
It must be. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, keep in mind, this is based on true events, things that actually happened. This is not something out of a fictional novel or anything else. These are things that actually happened, and it's well documented in United States jurisprudence. So there is a real serious hook here. And
I might add, sorry, Tony, I might add that, by the way, Arnie Johnson, the charge was reduced to manslaughter. The jury believed him. And so they reduced it from murder. He served 5 or so years, and he was out. And we met him 2 years ago after he stabbed somebody 19 times and claimed, and in his defense, the devil made him do it.
This demonic horror stuff, I'm a huge fan of the horror genre in general, but maybe it's because I was raised Catholic. This demonic stuff really hits me where I live. So this is it's essentially the 4th Conjuring movie, right? If you count Annabelle, which was sort of a spin-off, something like that. But
and I think that's the right way to say it. There's certainly this Conjuring universe that is, got the Nun and Annabelle all in it.
The Nun. I forgot about the Nun, right?
Yeah,
right.
It's quite a big franchise, but it's really kind of based on, I think that may be the most chilling, or let's call it kind of credible scare, is that this all happened to these people.
Yeah.
Yep.
So can we call it the Conjureverse then? Everybody's got to have a verse, you got to have
everybody's got a verse now.
The cinematic Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Monsterverse.
Lane, get off the phone, get off the mic, and go to copyright.gov and own that word.
There you go. And I get a quarter every time you use it.
John and Leanne, you got to do that. One of the two of you got to do that.
Get a website, start monetizing it as soon as possible. So get that damn movie out so we can make some money.
Right, seriously.
Hey, this kind of thing happens more often than you realize. Back when I was at the Crosstown Entertainment, we were doing a deal with Robert Zemeckis from Forrest Gump, Castaway,
Back to the Future.
He wanted a horror title of ours called Route 666, and he was going to make a movie out of the comic book. But the trademark for the movie title Route 666 was actually held by Showtime, because they did a movie of the same title 20 years prior. So when Zemeckis paid us, the $50,000 for the option, for the 1-year option, we then had to turn that $50,000 over to Lionsgate to buy the damn title back.
Oh man!
So there could be $50,000 in your future.
All right. So Skyman, I guess you did with Daniel Myrick. And it must have gone so well that you're doing another one. You've got a horror short you're working on, or am I making that up?
Black Veil.
Yeah, so
Black Veil, yeah.
Black Veil. So Dan, who's really lovely and really a very bright filmmaker, and certainly, I think I could say, he and his partner created the found footage genre that started with a thing called the Blair Witch Project.
Oh, yeah.
And so Dan grew up here in Florida. And so about a year and a half or so ago, he reached out and said, "Hey, I'm working on this Southern Gothic kind of really fun horror story. And we want to make kind of an episodic idea. Do you want to do it?" I'm like, dude, when? Of course. With you? Whatever. And what a great experience that was. Skyman is a really interesting kind of documentary style feature that, and I think it's still on Amazon right now.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting story about a guy who claims that he saw an alien when he was 10 or 12 years old, and the alien promised he would come back when he turned 40. So then the movie begins more or less with his 40th birthday, and he's got to go back to the desert to see this Skyman, this man from the sky. That's Dan's really brilliant creation. That's, very avant-garde and very, as is Dan prone to, kind of pushing the boundary of how to tell a feature story. Black Veil is a little bit, I'll say, more closer to his initial scare pattern. And we look forward to seeing that soon. But it's, obviously with this global pandemic, we had several ready to go, and then bingo,
Yeah, sure.
We learned what COVID-19 was. And that kind of put the kibosh on any more productions. They are about to start the second version, the second sequence in the Black Veil series, right here in Tampa Bay. So I may or may not be a part of it. I would love to, but I think you're going to see a really interesting filmmaker kind of play with something that, in a genre that he more or less created. And Black Veil's a little bit more straight down the line. Takes place in a small town in Florida that's kind of a spooky little moment that's, very emblematic of how good storytelling And really good teams can create stuff that, is fun and compelling. It's not very expensive, but it's very consumable.
Now, I actually want to go back a little bit to Skyman because, as you know, in the news recently, there has been a lot of talk about aliens or at least UFOs. So,
Oh, yes.
based on, your experience with this movie and thinking through that kind of thing, what do you think of our latest news craze?
Well, it's interesting because when Paul first got the Skyman gig, we would talk about it a lot. And the thing that
and by the way, I'm barely in it. I mean, I have this wonderful kind of news anchor presence that just, I think in the, this is not coming from me, but certainly in the confines of the story, kind of legitimizes UFOs and legitimizes this a potential other alien life. And certainly now we've seen in the last news cycle that there's something kind of brewing off the coast of Virginia that, our military has started to watch. So that's really curious, I think, for a lot of us.
Well, it's prescient what ended with Skyman, because there was this, when we first saw the script, there was a sense of, there's a bit of a credibility gap because, when I think of alien abduction, I think of Paul Dooley in the Christopher Guest movie, A Mighty Wind, where you would talk about, I was abducted by aliens about 10:30 at night, and now every Sunday night at 10:30, my buttocks hurts. And so I'm, we're thinking of that, but now we have, let's give credit where credit is due. The U.S. Navy has successfully rebranded UFOs as UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. That rebranding, using military jargon, has created a new credibility. And of course, releasing the videos that they couldn't explain, you would think it would be more jarring than it has been. But again, we have to look at popular culture. There's been a sense among the general population that UFOs are, we're kind of arrogant. It goes back to Carl Sagan's book, in
Sure.
Cosmos. We'd have to be incredibly arrogant to think we're the only intelligent life in the universe.
And now we're roving around on Mars. I mean, how about that in our lifetime, guys? Right?
And these guys with these propulsion systems that we can't explain are looking at us fly a helicopter on Mars going, oh, isn't that cute? Isn't that just adorable? It's precious.
So, Tony, you got some serious geek cred here. Leanne was telling me you referenced the cross-gen work, but she says you worked on a Tekwar game.
Oh, well, I mean, the funny thing is, I mean, what's laughingly known as my career is basically me Forrest Gumping through pop culture.
There are worse fates, right?
When I was in my late 20s, I was fortunate enough to get on with a video game company in Miami that was producing the Tekwar video game for Shatner. And this was a point in his career. This is before Third Rock from the Sun. This is before Boston Legal. This is before that whole renaissance in his career. And he was looking to get out of the yoke of Star Trek because he had finished Star Trek V. He hadn't done Star Trek VI yet, and Star Trek V did not do well. And he was kind of hurting from that. And we were trying to figure out, what do you do next? And now he was into this series of first the Tekwar novels, then the Tekwar TV, the Tekwar movies on USA. Then that begat a series. And he really wanted to hang his hat on Tekwar because it was just far enough away from Star Trek that it wasn't Star Trek, but it was still in the wheelhouse of his fan base. So we set out to make this video game. And it was quite possibly the worst video game ever burned to a CD at the time.
I was going to say, I'm not familiar with it. It
was a 3D shooter back in the early days of 3D shooters, and we built it on what Apogee called the build engine, and it's what Duke Nukem was built off of.
All right.
So we used the same engine as Duke Nukem with the intention of making this really cool science fiction 3D shooter, but our publisher was, how can I put this charitably? Because I don't want to. He was a moron. He was an imbecile.
If that's charitable, I would love to hear the uncharitable version.
And so he cut the last 3 months of production off because id Software, which was the people who created Doom, quit. I forget the name of the software company. They quit Doom and they formed their own software company, id, and then it later became Ion Storm. John Romero was the big producer then. So they're coming out with Quake, which is going to be a big 3D shooter. And our publisher was like, well, we have to beat Quake to the market because we don't want them to, to take our customers. It's like, okay, dude, you're not going to out John Romero because you're not John Romero. And secondly, people who buy 3D shooters buy all of them. They don't just buy one. But he cut it off. So our AI wasn't finished. In a 3D shooter, you should be able to see everyone, but you couldn't. People could sneak up on you and kill you, and you wouldn't know that they did it. Mm-hmm. So it was just horrible. It was just we had 150,000 units sold in, and then we took returns on almost 100,000 from retail.
Ouch!
Oh man! That's brutal.
But what we did get to do is I got to run a publicity campaign for Bill, and we did this thing on AOL, which was a ton of fun. We did it in conjunction with Entertainment Weekly. And the idea was this, and this was my harebrained scheme. And by the way, this is kind of a tribute to Shatner because as much nonsense there is in the Twitterverse about him and, he's this and he's that. And, people have old grudges from the 60s against him. I got to tell you, he was blue collar, showed up on time, knew what he was supposed to do, did everything that he was responsible for, and then made sure that everyone all down the food chain in the production, felt good about it. He would take, waitresses and waiters from the distribution party for drinks afterward, to thank them. He was just very, very amenable to anything. So I came up with this harebrained scheme because back in that time, 96, 97.
The AOL chat room.
Yes. Yep. That was the big thing. So I contacted the leader of the AOL chat room for Star Trek called The Bridge. I said, hey, I want to put Shatner in your room. And the idea is because you have all these fake Shatners on AOL right now, he's going to have to prove to your people that he's actually William Shatner. He said, don't do it. We don't want any hoaxes. We don't care about you. You're not connected with Shatner. I don't know who you are. We know if you knew Shatner because we know Shatner, that kind of thing. So, of course, being, the one who, is always, courteous and follows the rules, I did it anyway. So we did this conversation where he had 30 minutes to convince people that he was Bill Shatner. And we had him take a photograph with that day's USA Today newspaper in his hand to show the date, almost like a kidnap photo. So that at the end of the 30 minutes, I was going to post a photo in the chat room to say, you've really been talking to Bill. That first 30 minutes, though, was brutal. It was brutal. And they of course, they chastise him on his hair. Is that hair really yours? He says, it's absolutely all mine. I bought it. It belongs to me. And then there is, if you spend any time with Bill, at that point in time in Bill's career, he was sharing a trailer on the Universal backlot with Peter Falk. And if you want to talk about two drunk, dirty old men, then we posted the photo, and then the whole room changed. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to say that.
Well, it just shows you what a really self-deprecating and wonderful human being he really is, because he had fun with that. And he did. That's it's a testament to him.
And that became the cover story for the September, I think, 26, 1996 copy of Entertainment Weekly. And it was his first non-Star Trek cover in a national magazine since he was doing Barbary Coast on television in the 70s. And the title of the story was Counterfeit Bills.
Hope somebody got a raise for that.
Actually, shortly after that, I was recruited by an agency in New York and went to them. Where I
met a guy named Stan Lee.
Yeah.
All right. Now you have to tell us about that. Now you can't drop Stan Lee's name.
Yeah. Not in a place like this.
See, for me, Stan was kind of a personal thing. And, in the professional world, there's certain etiquette you should follow. You need to go through channels and you want to be able to present yourself in the perfect light. In the meantime, I was basically working for Hill and Knowlton, and I was stalking Stan. I started stalking, and I finally got in contact with him when he launched Stan Lee Media. And because I was with Hill and Knowlton, which was a reputable firm, despite the fact they hired me,
I did not know that.
Flew out to L.A., met with him, and Stan's attitude is, I've never actually had a publicist before. I don't know how it all works. And his CEO at the time said, you need one, we're hiring him. And I thought, okay, this guy really knows what he's doing. And it later turns out that his CEO, a gentleman named Peter Paul, then stole $5 million from the company and fled to Mexico. I'm sorry, Brazil. And then when they caught him and extradited him, he tried to sue everybody, including me.
Really?
So we got drama on this side of the microphone.
All right.
But I mean, at the end of the day, what we did was we did three things. Number one, because in 1999, when I started working with Stan, outside of the comic book industry, not many people knew him.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Right.
If you knew comics, you knew who Stan Lee was. If you didn't know comics, he wasn't a pop culture icon yet. So our plan was to go straight mainstream, and we hit it hard. And we used that incredible people who grew up on Stan Lee's comics are at that point in time were now in major positions of power.
Spider-Man, yeah.
You know, Reed Abelson was a writer at the New York Times. In fact, she's still a writer at the New York Times. And I contacted her in an attempt to get him into the Millennium Edition. They were planning the first edition of the 2000s. You know, January 1, 2000, New York Times. You know, being futurists and predicting what the next millennia will bring. So I was begging her to bring Stan in because what better futurist than a guy who writes comics and science fiction? And she's like, "Oh my God, I love Stan Lee. I didn't even know he was still alive. Oh yeah, we'd love to use him." And that caused a cascade. New York Times, Washington Post, AP, Reuters. Now everyone's starting to write about what Stan Lee's doing in his next chapter. And then we got an interview with Time Magazine. And Time Magazine loved the interview so much they wanted to do a cover shoot. So they did a cover shoot at Stan's house. And we were all excited. Stan Lee is going to be on the cover of Time friggin' magazine. That was, early 2000. And then McCain won New Hampshire. So John McCain got our cover, and our cover photo became a photo on the contents page.
No. Oh, well.
But the second thing we did was, because he'd been doing cameos in some of the TV shows, and it was always a kind of fun thing. If somebody asked him to do it, he'd do it. And our plan was, no, you have to have that in your contracts. Every single thing you work on, you need to do a cameo on, because that's how you penetrate the pop culture consciousness. Everything that's produced from any of your intellectual property, past, present, or future, you have to be there. It's not a courtesy anymore. We didn't, in 99, 2000, we did not envision the Marvel Cinematic Universe exploding the way it did. It became a real thing that helped people understand what his place in the pop culture firmament was. Mm-hmm. So that in the 2000s, everybody knew who Stan was. Not because of publicity, not because of him, being in major ad campaigns, but because every single movie based on a Marvel character had Stan in it. Stan was also incredibly charitable. Back in 2000, 2001 really, I worked together with a few other people in the comic book community to create a charity, which is now known as the Hero Initiative. Mm-hmm. Because the 1950s, 1940s, 1930s, all these comic book creators, guys like Marty Nodell, who created the Green Lantern, they never got royalty deals. All of their paychecks were called quitclaims, work for hires. When they would endorse their paycheck, they were literally signing their rights away to the things that they created.
Yep.
So by the time we got to the 90s and the 2000s, these guys were turning 70, 80, 90. They were living in trailer parks. Their homes were being foreclosed upon. They had medical conditions they couldn't address because they couldn't afford the doctor's bills. So we established Hero Initiative to provide financial and other assistance to these guys. And for the guys who still had jobs, to help them find work again, because they didn't want charity. They wanted to work. Mm-hmm. And so to raise money, we, Stan and Kevin Smith and a bunch of other people got together with me. Reggie Hudlin. The great film director. He just directed the documentary Black Godfather on Netflix, and he's doing a bunch of new stuff. HudlinEntertainment.com is a place to go. He directed the House Party movies. He directed Eddie Murphy and Boomerang and Marshall. And at the time, he was writing a comic book for Marvel called Black Panther. Uh-huh. So he came in, and we did a night at UCLA. We got Ackerman Hall at UCLA, a 1,000-seat hall, which they gave us for $150. And we did an evening with Stan Lee, hosted by Kevin Smith. And we had Joe Quesada, the current editor of Marvel Comics, in there. We got Reggie Hudlin. We got Tom DeSanto, who was the executive producer of the X-Men movie, who brought an X-Men poster that was signed by the entire cast and the director. And we did 3 hours at Ackerman Hall. It was standing room only. And we shot it as a DVD feature, which you can still find on Amazon and eBay. It's called Marvel Then and Now, an Evening with Stan Lee. And it's really the first place, because Stan's done dozens of interviews over the years talking about how he created Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and Hulk and so forth alongside his partners like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. But there was not one place where all those stories were told. Mm-hmm. So that video, it's got about 7 hours of content on it.
Oh, wow.
Because we did a 3-hour show that ended with them auctioning off that poster on stage for the charity. And I mean, we made $25. We made like $28,000 just that one night. But then when we sold the DVD, because everybody who was there worked for free. I worked for free. The crew worked for free. Will Hess directed it. He worked for free.
Stan didn't charge anything. Kevin didn't charge anything.
Well, I think Kevin dinged us for some weed, but.
That makes sense.
There's one. If you work with Kevin Smith, there's two things you need when in the green room: half-quart cartons of low-fat chocolate milk on ice, and Visine.
All right, I'm writing that down.
Because he's got to burn one or two in the limo on the way over. That's just the way it is. Now, Marty has since passed away, but he was very public about the help we gave him. What we did with Marty, because at the time, Warner Brothers was gearing up for a multi-million-dollar movie called The Green Lantern. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is before Ryan Reynolds was cast and it became, the debacle that it was. But the idea that they're going to make a movie based on this character that Marty's never received any royalties on ever was abysmal. So what we did, instead of trying to raise money as a charitable thing for him, we found an attorney that dedicated pro bono hours to suing Warner Brothers for back pay and back rights. And Warner's settled very generously.
Nice.
And whereas before the intervention, he was in a wheelchair and his home was being foreclosed upon, he was able to save his house and get the medical procedure so he could regain some mobility. So the last 5-6 years of his life, he was actually reasonably comfortable.
And a lot of that was because of Stan and Stan's generosity and his ability to kind of really care for those people that, were part of his whole story and his entire franchise.
Yeah, at that time, it had a different name, but nobody really knew about it. But Stan put his weight behind it, never charged us a dime. I mean, in Hollywood, the big thing is, the actor worked for free, but we still paid his per diem and his hotel and his travel. And Stan never charged his dime for anything.
Wow.
And I mean, and he signed so many posters and so many items that were auctioned off. I can't even begin. And Kevin as well was and is still incredible in that effort. Those guys carried the ball that was started back in 1978 by guys like Neil Adams and Frank Miller and Harlan Ellison, who were incensed that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman, weren't getting a dime off of that.
Right.
So they created a public outcry, and Warner Brothers, that owned DC at the time, had to create a settlement for Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. I mean, Joe Shuster was blind; he couldn't draw anymore, and Jerry Siegel at the time was working at the post office. Forgive me, I forgot the mute this thing.
Oh my God! Put it on cheap thrill mode.
That's all right. It's like the intermission. Here's a little music for the intermission.
But it is a constant battle. I mean, you saw Alan Dean Foster's issue with Star Wars and Disney, right?
Mm-hmm.
Alan Dean Foster did all these incredible
Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
Yep,
right.
Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
And after the assignment over to Disney took place, Disney refused the assignment of the royalty contracts while accepting the assignment of the rights.
Surprise.
And just 2 days ago, Alan Dean Foster posted on his blog that it looks like they are close to an amicable solution and expect an announcement shortly. So it looks like Disney's going to settle. So going back to 1978, especially in science fiction and comic books, we are still dealing with massive inequities for creators who aren't getting paid or aren't getting paid properly for the work that they do. And the irony is, you have these DC and Marvel movies going up. And on the Marvel side, I hear from creators, I'm getting lots of checks, but they're small. Mm-hmm. And on the Warner Brothers side, the DC side, I'm hearing, I'm getting very few checks, but they're big.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was thinking that you used to hear this much more as a knock on DC, and DC sounded like they started getting a little better, and now Marvel gets more of that.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with, with all these consolidations that really, the media consolidations really began, mid 2000s. So you've got these giant conglomerates that are, through that era, and certainly even, in the news of the last weekend, they're trying to figure out what they really need and really have to do in terms of debt and assets to move forward. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there is a world in which, the Marvel brand, the Disney Marvel brand, I should say, that we know now, was probably never conceived at the time that these stories that Stan Lee authored and, was part of. And now it's such a commercial enterprise that there were so many great artists, every level of them that I think they're now trying to reconcile with.
Well, you have an industry that for many, many decades had a longstanding culture of you're going to work and you're going to get paid for your work, but you're not going to share in the profits. Mm-hmm. And that was the underlying culture for many, many years.
But they never envisioned these characters. Like, look at Iron Man. I mean, and Iron Man is a really wonderful, I think, a great example here because, a guy named Jon Favreau, who, at the time we knew from Made, from a couple cool movies, he was friends with Vince Vaughn, is a really talented guy. And, then all of a sudden, Iron Man launched. Iron Man was a third tier at best superhero, right? Mm-hmm. And boom, that created the Marvel Universe. I mean, let's look at it that way. So that was a gamble. Oh, and by the way, gambles, Robert Downey Jr.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He was an insurance gamble for sure.
Oh, he absolutely was. But what an incredible, interesting move. I mean, a gutsy move for a director who, brought us Mandalorian to go back to, my Star Wars ilk. Mm-hmm. And now is kind of the marshal of the Star Wars brand. Jon Favreau probably is, the next Kathleen Kennedy. I mean, he's really done something incredible. But at the time, we're just talking about Iron Man, Tony, where at the time that was a bit of a gamble, not just from a star standpoint with, obviously Robert, RDJ, who, by the way, was a liability as we know, but an incredible presence. And that created what? Now 19 in a row?
No, 32.
32 in a row.
32 in a row that have not lost a dime. But if you really want to look at the brilliance of Jon Favreau, let's dig a little bit deeper. Iron Man was created as a third-tier character in the 60s, basically Stan wanted to take his swipe at Bruce Wayne. Because his knock against Bruce Wayne, who was Batman in DC's universe, was that, millionaires aren't selfless. Millionaires don't act like that. Millionaires are self-absorbed and they're womanizers and they're drinkers. And, if you're going to make a millionaire a superhero, then let's make a millionaire a superhero who's really that kind of narcissistic jackass. And and more than that, this was also Stan Lee's statement about the Vietnam War, because in the original Iron Man story, he wasn't taken captive, obviously, by Islamic extremists. He was taken captive by the Viet Cong. And he was in captivity with the Viet Cong, and that's when he created his first gray Iron Man armor to get out of that situation. So how do you update something that was born in the Vietnam anti-communist era for the modern age? So Favreau said, well, what's our Vietnam?
Meanwhile, let's not forget that Stanley and his compadres were in New York City during the Nazi invasion of France.
Well, that's a good story. Let me finish with Favreau, though. What he did was our Vietnam is our forever war in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. That's our generation's Vietnam that we're living with. Not the casualty rate of Vietnam, but still kind of an original sin, because there's that same sensibility of we never should have been there in the first place. So Favreau transplanted that into the modern era seamlessly, capturing the exact essence from the 60s without it being related at all to the current events of the 60s. And you got to remember, the Tom Cruise was attached to Iron Man for many, many years while it was with Universal. And Iron Man was not a Marvel Studios picture. It was a partnership between Marvel Studios and Paramount. David Maisel, who is probably the key architect of the Marvel Cinematic Universe from the business affairs standpoint today, he cut the first deal with Paramount to get roughly $200 million of Paramount money in return for giving Paramount the rights to distribute the first 3 Marvel Studios films, which were Iron Man, Captain America, the First Avenger, and the Incredible Hulk. All titles that at one point or another had been owned by Universal, the film rights. So what David Maisel did was he created this ability for Marvel to establish its own financial base once the Paramount deal was done, because that initial $200 million that Paramount gave them, they turned it into $2 billion over 3 pictures. So then they could do their own thing. But the biggest gamble, I mean, talk about the head of a needle, was RDJ was just out of rehab. He was a liability. Favreau was basically telling the studio, no, we don't want Tom Cruise. We want RDJ. And the studio is looking at them like they're from, are you insane?
After Mission Impossible with Brian De Palma,
I mean,
had already started.
Yeah, I mean,
which is probably our James Bond, right?
Tom Cruise is a franchise guy. He's going to help establish a franchise. We'll make movies forever with Tom Cruise. And Favreau's like, no, he's not the guy. He's not the guy. You got to see this guy. So that he literally had RDJ come in and do a screen test. And that screen test halfway sold the studio, but the studio said, we got to do one other thing. You're going to have to take out another completion insurance policy, and it's going to be on your dime. Because if he relapses, we want to get a big paycheck. So, I mean, talk about...
And the rest is history.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. I keep trying to imagine, as you're talking about this whole history, Iron Man without the grit that RDJ brings to the character. I mean, there is a depth to the character that you would never get out of Tom Cruise. And
well, I mean, I don't know if that's. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly accurate. Not to disagree, but I think there is and this is the actor now, the actor talking to you. There is a sense between your eyes when you know that you've got to read these lines and they touch on you emotionally. And I think it's fair to say that and I've met Tom Cruise and I know Tom Cruise, but I can tell you right now, and I've never met RDJ, I am sure as an actor of his stature and definitely his emotional commitment to things, this was very personal for him. And you can see it. And you can see it. And I think that's why we have that great character.
Yeah. And not for nothing, I don't think Tom Cruise's Iron Man or Tony Stark would have been substandard by any measure. It would have been different.
Maybe not as emotionally available as RDJ was.
Yeah. But who knows? I mean, when we saw Tom Cruise as Les Grossman in Tropic Thunder, we were all like, what? Where did
that come from? Right.
And a lot of the character came from him. Ben Stiller has talked about his initial meeting with Tom Cruise about it. Before they even wrote the character, they were just thinking about this character, and Tom Cruise says, I want to do it, but I want to have really large hands, and I have to dance.
Well, I think there's no secret that Tom Cruise likes to get physical in his movies. I mean, wait till we see Maverick, people. I mean, get ready. Get ready for Maverick.
But it's so in any event, but you get to RDJ, and I mean, that was lightning in a bottle that just kept repeating on itself.
Yeah, sure was.
Because, but that's the point, is it was such a great gamble. And I think that goes back to the visionary and the commitment of Favreau.
Yeah.
And Kevin Feige, by the way.
Yeah. Who, by the way, here's something interesting. You have Warner Brothers and their DC movie unit, and you've got Disney with their Marvel movie unit. Kevin Feige is the head of Marvel. Jeff Johns, until recently, was the head of DC's. Well, they were both interns in the offices of Richard Donner.
Oh, all right. That makes sense.
There you go. Iron Man came out of nowhere. It was like, low expectations. Let's go have fun. I remember, and he was fun as Chaplin. And, this could be cool. And I remember Less Than Zero. And then boom. Oh my God, he's a superhero.
Oh
my God.
And it
launched
was
the entire thing.
It wasn't just that he was successful in the role. I remember that before the movie came out, people were excited. I mean, there's always been, there's a lot of actors out there who have rough times, and they never get treated the same by the the audience ever again. But something charismatic about this guy. For years, people have wanted him to succeed, and people got excited knowing he was hired.
Well, let's not forget his dad was a pro, and he grew up in the world. And there's really a really wonderful interview with him on Netflix with David Letterman. My guest needs no introduction. But what's really fun, I think, about now looking back, because no one really could have predicted this. Mm-hmm. I mean, could we have? It was a gamble that kind of was like, you can't lose. Let's have fun with it. And that's one of the things I think that in the entertainment world that Marvel, and now Disney, obviously, has down. Entertainment should be fun.
Yeah.
It's fun. And it's, by the way, going to be crazy, but it's going to be fun. Get ready for a ride. And I think that's where Favreau did this justice right up front of, it's going to be a ride. And, welcome to the ride. And I think that's where the others really have paled.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, you're talking about the behind the scenes stuff that's been so critical in making these things happen. If Favreau hadn't been able to trump the studio, if RDJ hadn't been Iron Man, would there even be an MCU today? Mm-hmm. Kevin Feige fighting Ike Perlman for control, that was not his first battle, because Kevin Feige was originally the assistant to a guy named Avi Arad.
Oh, right.
Who was Amy Pascal's partner in the Sony Spider-Man films, the first ones with Tobey Maguire, and Avi also produced the animated films, and he was, the animated series, rather.
He was Toy Biz Marvel, right?
Right.
That's right.
Avi Arad came out of the toy business and got into the movie business, and he was exactly the kind of mogul that you don't want in front of your franchise, because he's sucking all the air out of the room along with most of the money.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin Feige was his assistant. Kevin Feige was only elevated to president of Marvel Studios after Avi Arad was kind of left/pushed out. But you see, Avi thought that he was going to spin himself off like Amy Pascal has years later as kind of like his own production company, his own producer on the back of his work for Marvel. And then came, we're going back to our PR campaign with Stan Lee back in the early 2000s, to the moment when Kevin Feige saw his opening. It was the 60 Minutes interview with Stan Lee. It was on the eve of the release of the second Spider-Man movie. And it was a very critical interview, because it was the first time Stan had ever been on anything like 60 Minutes. It was after the Time magazine almost cover. It was after New York Times. And this was kind of like the coming out thing. And about a week before the interview was done at Stan's house, I get a call from Steve Croft, who did the interview for 60 Minutes. And he said, look, I'm not Mike Wallace. I don't like gotcha questions, so I'm going to tell you up front, I know about the lawsuit, and we're going to ask about it. The lawsuit was Stan was suing Marvel and Sony for $10 million of Spider-Man 1 royalties that he never got, that he was contractually obligated to receive. And it was a personal thing for Stan, because he was suing the company that, he helped create. Mm-hmm. And it was hurtful and painful. And so, of course, I relate that conversation to the executive team. And, 2 days later, we're in L.A. in the boardroom with all the attorneys. And, no comment. You have to say no comment, no comment, no comment. And, I'm the weenie, and I'm
he's selling himself short, by the way.
I'm pushing through the food chain saying, no comment's a pejorative. It means you're hiding something. Stan, you're not hiding anything. I said, do you want to talk about this? He says, no, I don't want. Just say that. I don't want to talk about this. Steve Croft asked you the question. I don't want to talk about it. He asked you again. I really don't want to talk about it. In fact, look at your shoes when you do. Don't even make eye contact.
Look at your shoes. Remember that line.
And of course, Stan's there. It's his house in Hollywood Hills. It's very quaint. It's very cozy. It's very reminiscent of, little row houses you'd have up in New York, when you're on the inside. When you're on the outside, it's kind of a big house with two Bentleys in the driveway. But he's sitting there, in his house wearing his members only jacket. I think he was the last member.
Yeah.
So I had the word switch, only member, not members.
Yeah. There you go. And Steve asked the question, and he did exactly what we recommended he do. That aired on a Sunday. Monday afternoon, Marvel calls that they're going to settle. Well, Marvel/Sony calls they're going to settle. They settled for the full amount.
Nice.
Because on national television, it looks like these giant corporations are beating up on this little old man in his members only.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd completely forgotten about that. That's
Well, here's the key thing. Right before Stan was asked the question about the lawsuit and everything else, there was a 3-minute segment in the 60 Minutes piece with Avi Arad talking about all the billions of dollars these movies are going to make over the years.
Mm-hmm.
That was the last we heard of Avi Arad. Shortly thereafter, and that caused the ascension of Kevin Feige.
Mm-hmm.
Well, helped precipitate it because Kevin does his own thing. He's brilliant.
By the way, nothing against Kevin.
Yeah.
Kevin's created an empire that will live probably past 3 lifetimes.
Not since the contract days where Abbott and Costello would be doing a movie like every 3 months. Not since those days has a studio put together a string of 30+ movies that have made money, each and every one of them.
Speaking of empire, can we talk about Star Wars?
Yes.
You guys are crazy. I was like, we're going to talk about what movies are doing and everything. And here we are like an hour later and we're talking about Star Wars. And this is a blast. I could do this. We're going to have to divide this up into 3 or 4 episodes of the podcast.
We can do this a lot,
God.
by the way, because we love you guys and we appreciate this. But, we have chapters. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, let's talk Star Wars, by God. I mean, we broached Star Trek. We got to talk Star Wars.
All right. So you've seen The Searchers, right? You've seen The Searchers.
Oh, he's going John Ford. Okay.
No, hang on.
Okay.
You've seen The Searchers, right?
Yep.
I haven't.
For anybody listening, if you haven't seen The Searchers, and by the way, Star Wars begins with a thing called New Hope. Although it's called Episode 4, it is number 1.
It's called Star Wars. Thank you very much. I stood in line for it. It was called Star Wars.
There you go.
No episode, no hope. There was no hope.
That's right. They did that.
It was hopeless.
Yep.
Creating volumes and inventory later after, they didn't know what they had.
Well, see, this is the thing. In Hollywood, there's 3 columns. There's business affairs, marketing, and creative. And what George was trying to do at the time was just get the damn movie out. And we've all seen the documentaries about just,
which everybody passed on.
Yeah, which everybody passed on. And he finally got, Fox to generate some revenue, some money for it. And then halfway in, he's like, oh, guys, we're going to need more money. I mean, it was a tightrope walk over a chasm with no safety net. So he wasn't thinking franchise. He wasn't thinking marketing. He was thinking, oh, my God, please let us just get this movie out. And then afterward, the marketing column kicks in because George did one thing that was very, very wise. He kept the merchandising rights for himself.
Well, he revolutionized the whole industry by doing that, didn't he?
Absolutely. And now he needed to come up with, well, I want to do a lot more of these. So how do I make it, how do I ensure? And he went back to his original story outline and he thought, well, this technically kind of like falls in the middle. So I'll do the middle. And that's where it was a marketing thing. But when the marketing and the creative crosses over, what happens? It energizes the fans, either negatively or positively, but they're all talking about it.
I have in my hand, which ultimately I think we need, speaking of chapters, one more version of this, but I have in my hand an Empire Strikes Back glass that's a water glass that may be in the neighborhood of 5.5 inches tall from Burger King.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I have an entire series of these.
Wow.
And I won't tell you what he has in his other hand.
Well, I noticed the camera's off, so I figured there was a reason.
Actors are a little, private.
Actors don't like to show their faces. I understand.
We have to be emotionally available at all times.
Right.
So we're despite the, large, I don't want to say disappointment, but I'm going to say it anyway. Disappointment, financially too, of this last Star Wars movie trilogy. Despite that, we seem to be in the golden age of Star Wars. Well, Favreau, there you go. Brings us right back around. It's all him, right?
We already seeded this conversation, but I think at the beginning of it, I mean, that phenomenon that was this R2D2 C3PO, a giant Wookiee that was, as George Lucas, even said, that was inspired by his dog, which I think is wonderful because Indiana Jones was named after his dog. So there's a wonderful kind of great, authentic, auteur that really had, and I hope that a lot of us have seen, or, those that are listening, if they haven't, go back and watch American Graffiti. That's the precursor to Star Wars. Not necessarily from a plot, but certainly from a LA 60s cars, little Ronnie Howard, little Harrison Ford,
Little Mackenzie Phillips,
Richard Dreyfuss, and Shirley. Cindy Williams. So we're seeing kind of a fast moving life and he was always, Skywalking is a really fun book that you kind of get a feel for. He was, and he self-admitted, not a very good student, but really enjoyed fast cars and kind of the whole moving of those 50s and 60s cars. And then you kind of start to see Phantom Menace. And you take a look at that entire opening tableau of all that borderline Blade Runner on crack. Those moments where there's so much visual arresting going on with moving, cars and images. But at the end of the day, it's a Western in space. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the fun part of the frontier that he created that turns into, there's a merchandising aspect that, by the way, is big. I mean, giant. But at the core of the story, and I think that's why JJ really kind of gets it. Like Favreau, is that it's about the frontier. It's about living alone. It's about finding who you're really from, who you knew, who created this. That's the human experience. I think he really tapped into, and 1976 as they made the movie.
And it's interesting that the idea that you're sort of, hearkening back to American Graffiti as sort of the ancestor to some of this. You're right, because it's ironic, but it sure ain't THX 1138, which would be the first thing you would think, right? Sci-fi, but
that was basically
an incredible studio lab, project that I think the great Robert Duvall, and what an incredible kind of experimental story on the heels of obviously 2001. Mm-hmm. And, Kubrick loomed large for these guys. But you got to remember, these guys, Spielberg, Coppola, Lucas, Michael Mann, they were all part of that whole class of, are you an editor? Are you a filmmaker? Are you a shooter? Are you a storyteller? Are you a writer? By the way, none of them really were writers. They were all camera storytellers. Some would do it better. I think Spielberg, and I'll say it right now, is probably the best visionary of the whole group. Lucas probably is the best visual storyteller, not quite like Spielberg in terms of camera movement, but Spielberg leaned on John Ford. And Lucas really leaned on John Ford.
He didn't lean on John Ford. He leaned into John Ford.
Yeah.
You could literally take the beat for beat.
And we all know, I think, cinema history will tell us that, Stagecoach may have been the most celebrated of all of the so-called, classic Westerns, but The Searchers, there are moments, beat for beat, frames for frame, that is Star Wars.
And it's not just the frames. It's everything else about the film, too. Nobody can argue that the music of John Williams is not a part of the character of Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Well, The Searchers, True Grit, Magnificent Seven, all those Westerns of those days all had Elmer Bernstein.
This giant, expansive canvas of sound that, at the time we were, enjoying and kind of helped us into this, 70 millimeter cinemascape kind of feel that I think these great filmmakers really capitalized on, but also kind of got. Maybe more so Spielberg and Lucas. I mean, and by the way, that's heads or tails. I mean, both of them are equal in that sense, where they really, to me, really get that sense of space and emotion with orchestra that we haven't seen really since. I mean, Zemeckis did it too. And Alan Silvestri, I mean, one of the best of all time. But to now hear that John Williams at 85 years old is coming back, not that that's really old, but that's older. And, to have him come back for Indiana Jones, who will be almost 80 when that movie comes out. What does that tell you about the storytelling? That's a imbued kind of sense of music is not just a kind of additive component. It is the emotional arc that we have to have.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
those guys did that better than anybody.
And the commitment, I mean, to be doing that, to have John Williams come back in and do it now at this age, I mean, it really implies a real emotional ownership and a commitment to the whole franchise, the whole process. And, it's just a collective energy that it comes through.
Well, in the Poetics, not to go there, but in the Poetics, Aristotle once wrote, the most Dionysian of all emotions is catalyzed by music. Mm-hmm. And that was 800 BC.
Yeah, and he also said, not long after that, there is nothing so serious as a child at play. And that's when you get down to it, Spielberg, Lucas, Zemeckis,
Donner.
I was at a meeting. It was a meeting. It was a conference call with Zemeckis and Bob Gale and another producer, and we were talking about one of the cross-gen properties. And I was the marketing weenie at the time, and I'm just taking notes. And then Bob says to me, "So what do you think, Tony? What do you think about how's this plot work out?" I'm like, I'm just the marketing weenie. I'm not qualified to weigh in on this conversation. I'm just here to take the notes and make sure we're on a message. and then he says, do you like movies? I said, yeah. He says, do you see a lot of them? I said, yeah. He says, you're qualified. Because that's how he sees himself. These guys are children at play.
That's right.
And they have these amazing
And what a wonderful kind of inspiration that is for all of us as artists to rekindle or re-enliven that childlike sense of story. I mean, that's all what we want, right?
And it's got to have some joy.
I was about to say, that's where the joy comes from.
Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm.
We can talk, going back from the days of Shakespeare, there are no new ideas. We talk about how originality is dead. There are different levels of originality, but really it comes back to that, that great Joseph Campbell book, Hero of a Thousand Faces. The hero's journey really isn't any different than it's been since the first time we read about it in Greek mythology. And this is our mythology. And while we recognize that Luke Skywalker is a fictional character, as opposed to the days of the Greeks and the Nordics who believed that their gods existed, but even then there was that sense of, we know these are just stories because we're just kind of, grasping for our place in the universe.
And I think a lot of it has to do with the media. And certainly through the 70s when television was exploding and, TV news and, the reliance on television before a thing called the internet, children. I know that's hard to believe. And a thing called the cell phone, which I know is impossible to ignore. We relied on television, and there were 3 back then. CBS, ABC, NBC.
The PBS, Nova.
And then came PBS, which was like, oh, that's smart because of the government. So they're smarter than us. But yes, I mean, certainly the big 4, I should say that. but that's how storytelling got conveyed to the consumer. And we're all consumers, you know? And I think that's kind of where the zeitgeist was from a storyteller like a Spielberg. I mean, Jaws, you know, which was wonderful because it came out, Memorial Day, I think, of 77 or somewhere in that range. And like everyone goes to the beach. I mean, wow, what a marketing decision that was, based on the, absolute perfect polarity of this is how media will disseminate to the masses. Be careful at the beach this weekend. I mean, perfect storms that I don't think we're going to see with the fracturing of media today.
Yeah, there used to be a commonality that, everybody had, these were the shows that the stories that informed our lives. That really isn't the case now, where, my kids will go, to their little corners of the internet and, read their fan fiction or whatever and have an entirely different experience from what I'm having, watching what I'm watching, and so on. And we don't have that shared zeitgeist.
Well, I think to your point, just to buttress that, is that there used to be a thing called event television. NBC called it must-see TV. Must-see TV? I must cook dinner. I must get home. There is no toll booth mentality in television anymore. And I think that's where we're dealing with a lot of interesting kind of media changes. Is it certainly with, over the top OTT television or Wi-Fi delivered content that, by the way, you, Mr. or Mrs. Consumer, can choose when you want to watch it. What a wonderful luxury that is, that I think we've all been maybe yearning for, but now that's made, the conglomerates and the media, giants go, oh shit, we fucked up. We should have figured that out.
But you got to remember, you got companies like Sony, Toshiba, that have their own plays through partnerships, what have you, in popular culture. Look at the parallel that they have. They own the hardware. They sell the hardware to consumers that they can watch television on, and then they produce the content that goes on the television hardware that they just sold. When we were growing up, if you had a 15-inch television, you were in the high country. Now you can buy a television the size of your damn wall, which makes the movie theater like, well, why bother with a movie theater now? Because I can see, I can have this wall size thing in my house. But look at that paradigm. They own the hardware that they sold you, and they produce the content that you then watched on it. Now look, Netflix has already bought 2 theaters. Disney's going to start buying movie theaters, as is Amazon at some point, because about a year ago, maybe more than a year ago.
That's right.
The DOJ eliminated a rule.
December 2019.
Yeah, December 2019. They eliminated the rule that was built in the 50s.
Rule.
In the 50s, Paramount owned almost every theater in the country. And the other studios said, hey, wait a minute, you're not allowed to own both ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Yeah. Meanwhile, of course, in Japan, they were planning on doing exactly that since the beginning of televisions, owning both ends of the marketplace, the content and the hardware that you deliver the content on. Well, that rule was eliminated. So as we continue to recover, the only thing I think that's holding it off right now is AMC's stock price is still artificially high.
So it's interesting. You see a parallel between what's happening now with media to what happened in the computer industry in the 80s and 90s, where the hardware basically, and I guess we can count theaters as hardware in a sense, was commoditized so that it could be the mechanism for its sole purpose was really a mechanism for distributing the real product, which is the software.
Well, we can talk about binge watching and all the cultural changes in how we consume and even produce content. But at the end of the day, it is the exact same paradigm going back to Da Vinci's days. The marriage of art and commerce has always been a shotgun wedding. The Mona Lisa was a commissioned piece. Somebody paid Da Vinci to paint a picture of my niece. So art must have patrons. You've got to have money in order to make the art.
It actually should be called business show.
Not show business.
Right.
But at the end of the day, the reason you're seeing the same paradigms enact themselves over and over again, because it still comes back to the people who own the content and the people who own the hardware are the people who make the money.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as we despise them and hate them in our hearts because they have so much money and boy, but the artists who we enjoy, who we revere, would never have gotten a dime in pay if not for those guys.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So the same paradigms are going to keep happening over and over again, because while culture has changed and storytelling has changed and watching has changed, the business of how you make money hasn't changed since the time money was invented.
Anyways, you all should
Let's
go
do it
on
again.
without me, but let's do this again. Yeah.
Let's do it again. You guys are great. Thank you so
hell
much
yeah.
for having us.
This is so much fun. My God. And like I say, I feel like we've scratched the surface of whatever we're scratching that's beneath the surface. I want to, let's keep going.
You got to put a Band-Aid on it so it heals.
right. And then we can rip it off again in a few weeks. It'll be great.
All right.
Here's a good thing. By the way, in a couple, maybe a month or so,
Yeah.
it will be released that I am playing Richard Nixon on a Showtime show. So then we can talk about The First Lady, which is really wonderful, with Viola Davis and Gillian Anderson, and really Michelle Pfeiffer. At the end of the day, it's historic moments told from the White House from The First Lady. It's about damn time we heard this.
Really?
And Showtime is marshaled that effort, and that show I shot 2 months ago will probably be ready like the next time we do this.
Yeah.
So then we can talk about that.
That sounds great.
That sounds fantastic. And
It's great.
We'll have you back in a
this
month
is
then.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Let's do it.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Open World Chat. Leanne and I will see you back again in 2 weeks. Our theme music is by Chris Piatek.